The world you live in is under a mass fear and trauma, which often goes by the terms mass psychosis or mass hysteria. You might have heard of one of these terms, and you can look them up if you'd like, but perhaps it might be at the root to a lot of the diseases and physical manifestations we see in our world, as our mind gives way to our actions, and our actions give way to the world condition that we all live in, and then that condition then contributes to even more mentalities, and it's sort of a self-perpetuating cycle. And as we may know, with mental ailments or even diseases, some of it can be passed on generationally. So if we aren't addressing it at some point in time, and perhaps we're unaware of it all the time, then it's going to come back, or we're not going to be aware when it does come back. We're not going to be able to prevent it, to treat it. And this is why you may look at the world of mental epidemics and we say, I don't know how to treat that. And these are really difficult. Depression, anxiety, trauma, fear. What are these? But these do have a relationship to each other, and perhaps there are mass deceptions so powerful that are contributing to these conditions. The condition of an individual who cannot be aware or be in a position of courage and love, as these have been suppressed, is known as fear. The individual in fear becomes vulnerable to those who take advantage of their lack of awareness and sense of self. In manifestation on an individual and collective basis, we may observe that from fear comes ignorance, then confusion, then control, and then chaos. In relation to fear is the notion of trauma, for which fear itself may consist thereof. Trauma can be defined as an overwhelming experience that exceeds an individual's capacity to cope. It can be caused by a variety of events, including physical or emotional abuse, neglect, loss, or violence. Psychologist Gabor Mate argues that cultural trauma such as colonization, war, discrimination, or socioeconomic inequalities can permeate generations, shaping the collective psyche. Unresolved trauma can be transmitted from one generation to the next, leading to cycles of dysfunction, addiction, and violence. He calls for a shift from punishing approaches to addiction, crime, and mental illness to one that emphasizes understanding, support, and healing. It is often said that the escape from fear is courage or bravery, and that the opposite of fear is love and care. This shadow work, as Dr. Young calls it, is one that everybody goes through in some regards of their life. For a slave, we may imagine that work can be quite tough, which is why the 19th century abolitionists, being outsiders of the slaves, were able to share the burden, in a sense, for helping the slaves become free. Perhaps this, among making it hard for the media to attack them, is another reason why they emphasized their law of love and non-resistance to never add fuel to the fire of the already existent violence. In studying psychology, it would be interesting to also observe the mind of the slave owner, for which Larkin Rose deeply details in his talk The Nature of the Beast, identifying it as toxic narcissism. A slave owner doesn't truly love a human being that they consider less than human or adequate for slavery, other than as a means for their own power and suppressing their own shadows or insecurities. The slave owner is in fear of losing their slave control, remaining ignorant of their own responsibilities and their slave's own property. A slave may never know real love, as obedience to authority is the only virtue, the only reward. Notice the cruel hardships endured by slaves, the harsh punishments created by slave owners, and the revolution attempts by slaves throughout history, which could all be detailed as their own works. It does not matter which slave was punished more than another if slavery is inherently wrong. Slavery should not be committed or condoned at all. Hence, it is why the 19th century abolitionists were called immediatists as opposed to gradualists. They saw the lesser problem as still a problem, for within sight was also the solution that does not need to be a problem at all. In other words, they saw better conditioned slavery as, well, still slavery, for within sight was the solution of freedom that does not need to be slavery at all. While physical slavery may be a more covert form of overt physical slavery, it must be addressed if it always leads to the condition of physical slavery. Similarly, while better conditioned slavery may be a more covert form of overt violent slavery, it must be addressed if it always leads to the condition of violent slavery. Trauma resurfaces if it is unaddressed. Our fears never faced will lead us nowhere, and power gets abused, as history is evident of examples. Perhaps nobody is supposed to be in that position of power as slave master or slave to begin with. Asking this question was needed for too long, for it came at the expense of many millions of people, all the death in the world just from one lie. Dr. Carl Jung states that mass psychosis or mass deception is the greatest form of catastrophe in the world. What does this wisdom share with us in light of democide, the top cause of death? The act contributes to the condition and vice versa, but any action first requires a mindset or mental state that permits it. So ask yourself, what is this idea of a mass psychosis or mass hysteria? It is a lie, a mental deception, perhaps a fear, a trauma ingrained in people, unable to be addressed, unable to be seen, and which is why they are in a psychosis. Psychosis, by definition, means they don't know what is real, what is not. They're stuck. They're deceived. And so Jung tells us it is not famine, not earthquakes, not microbes, but man himself who is man's greatest danger to man, for the simple reason that there is no adequate protection against psychic epidemics, which are infinitely more devastating than the worst of natural catastrophes. Seneca, a philosopher, said, "Show me a man who is not a slave. One is a slave to lust, another to greed, another to ambition, and all men are slaves to fear." It is important to note here with this quote that slavery to things or emotions may be found in ourselves, since it may contribute to our external condition and our most affecting forms of slavery. As Oscar Wilde states, pity he has, of course, for the poor, for those who are shut up in prisons, for the lowly, for the wretched, but he has far more pity for the rich, for the hard hedonists, for those who waste their freedom in becoming slaves to things. In any case, whether we're talking about things or emotions, the same dynamics of freedom and dependence or lack of self-ownership and autonomy are at stake. So ask yourself if you are enslaved to, not just in the sense of chattel slavery, being chained to another or having, your own property owned by another, but a slave to the things in your environment, a slave to your own emotions. Can you ask yourself those questions? It starts to help us understand why fear and trauma could be rather powerful. Jean-Jacques Rousseau says you care more for profit than for liberty, and you fear slavery far less than you do poverty. Marcus Aurelius, another philosopher, said Alexander and Caesar and Pompey, compared with Diogenes, Heraclitus, and Socrates, the philosophers knew the what, the why, the how. Their minds were their own. The others, nothing but anxiety and enslavement. Thomas Jefferson, from American Independence, says when the people fear the government, there is tyranny, and when the government fears the people, there is liberty. Mark Twain said, courage is resistance to fear, mastery of fear, not absence of fear. And Twain is a great, funny author and abolitionist. In many countries, he says, we have taken the savage's land from him and made him our slave and lashed him every day and broken his pride and made death his only friend and overworked him till he dropped in his tracks. And this we do not care for because custom has inured us to it. He's rather serious here. I knew the man had a right to kill his slave if he wanted to, and yet it seemed a pitiful thing and somehow wrong, though why wrong I was not deep enough to explain if I had been asked to do it. Nobody in the village approved of that murder, but of course, no one said much about it. The conscience, the unerring monitor, can be trained to approve any wild thing you want it to approve if you begin its education early and stick to it. In my schoolboy days, I had no aversion to slavery. I was not aware that there was anything wrong about it. No one arraigned it in my hearing. The local papers said nothing against it. The local pulpit taught us that God approved it. Robert Anton Wilson, a psychologist, said the fear of death is the beginning of slavery. Butler Schaeffer, a philosopher, said because we fear the responsibility of our own actions, we have allowed ourselves to develop the mentality of slaves. Contrary to the stirring sentiments of the Declaration of Independence, we now pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor not to one another for our mutual protection, but to the state whose actions continue to exploit, despoil, and destroy us. Going back to the idea that the abolitionists were often not just fighting slavery, but the systems that were promoting slavery, such as the government. Larkin Rose even gives us great insight here. He's an author and screenwriter. He says, even slaves can exhibit a dread of being freed. This is because the life of a prisoner or a slave, though not likely fulfilling, is predictable, and imagining a new, drastically changed life in a strange place among strangers with all of the related uncertainties. How will I eat? Where will I live? What will it be like? Will I be safe? It scares almost everyone. So it is when most people contemplate human society without a ruling class. The concept is so foreign to everything they have ever known and ever thought about, and everything they were taught is necessary and good, that they hardly know how to even begin to imagine it. Even our very language illustrates our fear of living in society as free equals, because such a state is defined as anarchy, a term also used to describe chaos and destruction. We have grown so accustomed to the mental cage, which the myth of authority has formed around each of us, that most of us are terrified of the idea of life without that cage. We are literally scared of our own freedom. This sounds a lot like mental slavery as opposed to physical slavery. Thomas Paine from American Independence said reason was considered as rebellion, and the slavery of fear had made men afraid to think. William Godwin said the most wretched of all slaveries is that which I endure alone, the whole weight of which falls upon my own shoulders, in which I have no fellow sufferer to share with me a particle of my burthen. Under this slavery the mind shrinks, I am left alone with my tyrant, and am utterly hopeless and forlorn. Frederick Douglass says it is the duty of the master occasionally to whip a slave to remind him of his master's authority. Such was his theory and such his practice. Mr. Hopkins was even worse than Mr. Whedon. His chief boast was his ability to manage slaves. The peculiar feature of his government was that of whipping slaves in advance of deserving it. He always managed to have one or more of his slaves to whip every Monday morning. He did this to alarm their fears and strike terror into those who escaped. His plan was to whip for the smallest offenses to prevent the commission of large ones. Mr. Hopkins could always find some excuse for whipping a slave. It would astonish one unaccustomed to a slaveholding life to see with what wonderful ease a slaveholder can find things of which to make occasion to whip a slave. A mere look, word, or motion, a mistake, accident, or want of power are all matters for which a slave may be whipped at any time. Does a slave look dissatisfied? It is said he has the devil in him and it must be whipped out. Does he speak loudly when spoken to by his master? Then he is getting high-minded and should be taken down a buttonhole lower. Does he forget to pull off his hat at the approach of a white person? Then he is wanting in reverence and should be whipped for it. Does he ever venture to vindicate his conduct when censured for it? Then he is guilty of impudence, one of the greatest crimes of which a slave can be guilty. Does he ever venture to suggest a different mode of doing things from that pointed out by his master? He is indeed presumptuous and getting above himself, and nothing less than a flogging will do for him. Does he, while plowing, break a plow, or while hoeing, break a hoe? It is owing to his carelessness, and for it the slave must always be whipped. I will give Mr. Freeland the credit of being the best master I ever had, till I became my own master. For my part, I shall prefer death to hopeless bondage. And finally, Hein Reiner, a Stoic philosopher, said, "It is only through contempt for pain and fear, by contempt for all authority and obedience, that I liberate my being." That quote from Frederick Douglass is rather powerful, isn't it? Talking about this idea of how the slave master will try to find every excuse to enslave their fellow man. Every excuse to strike fear in others so that way they don't disobey the slave master's orders. Ask yourself if we live in a world of many, many laws for even the smallest of things, like drinking a certain product, growing a certain food, growing a certain plant overall, being able to just walk from place to place, being able to hand out information, or speak your mind. At what point do we say that there are some parallels between the slavery then and the slavery now? For we addressed mental and physical slavery. Are there still other forms? We have yet to get to that point. But if you are seeing the patterns in this documentary, and I encourage you to continue this documentary, you will see just how big you have been lied to, that the fear has been stricken in everybody, away from the most obvious truths, such as the fact that Frederick Douglass recognized that he is his own master. So simple, yet humanity was so far for so long. And yet again, we are far from something right in front of us. Why is that? Let us continue. Thank you for watching this part of the docu-series Slavery Gone for Good. Be sure to watch our other parts for a more deep understanding as to the nature of truth and action in its fullest extent. If you want to learn more and hear more quotes that have not been discussed in this video, be sure to buy the book Slavery Gone for Good Black Book Edition. This is the most important work in history, and you are part of that work. Do not forget it. As Frederick Douglass, former slave and abolitionist, said, "Knowledge makes a man unfit to be a slave."